Right now, American warships are surrounding a country most Americans couldn't find on a map. 95 people are already dead. Congress wasn't consulted. The media barely covered it, and it's all happening again. The year is 2025, and we might be watching the beginning of another American war in Latin America. But here's what they're not telling you. This is the story of how a war on drugs became something much darker. How maximum pressure became maximum violence, and how the most powerful military on earth is blockading one of the poorest nations in the Western Hemisphere, all without a declaration of war. But it gets worse, much worse. Because what's happening off the coast of Venezuela right now could trigger the largest refugee crisis in the history of the Americas. We're talking about potentially 3 to 4 million more people fleeing their homes. That's on top of the 7.7 million who have already escaped. And the man making these decisions, he's doing it without asking Congress, without asking you, without even pretending this is about what they claim it's about. So buckle up, because what I'm about to show you will change how you see American foreign policy forever. What they're not showing you, let's start with what you didn't see on the news. And trust me, there's a reason you didn't see it. Since August 2025, the United States has deployed the USS Gerald R. Ford, one of the world's most advanced aircraft carriers, to the Caribbean. That's 90,000 tons of military power, capable of launching 75 aircraft, now stationed off the coast of Venezuela. This ship alone costs over $600 million a year just to operate. But the carrier. That's just the tip of the iceberg. We've also deployed guided missile destroyers, amphibious assault ships carrying Marines, a nuclear-powered submarine, F-35 stealth fighters, B-52 bombers, EA-18G Growlers, which are electronic warfare aircraft used to jam enemy radar and communications. These are the same planes we use before major bombing campaigns. In total, we now have approximately 15,000 American troops in the Caribbean region. Some are on ships. Some are stationed in Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic. The U.S. has moved refueling aircraft, search and rescue helicopters, and specialized strike aircraft into position. Military analysts say the configuration of forces we've assembled is consistent with preparation for land strikes deep inside Venezuelan territory. Not coastal operations, not just drug interdiction, full-scale strikes inland. This is the largest American military deployment in Latin America since the Cold War. Let me repeat that. The largest deployment since the Cold War. And what have they done with all this firepower? Since September 2, 2025, American forces have conducted at least 25 strikes on boats in international waters. 25 separate attacks. The official count as of December 15, 95 people killed, 2 survivors who were repatriated to their home countries, and 1 survivor who's presumed dead after Mexico gave up searching for him after 4 days. 95 people, dead, no trial, no arrest, no lawyers, no due process, just eliminated. The kill list nobody's talking about. Here's where this story gets really dark. The Washington Post reported that the very first strike on September 1st wasn't just 1 attack. It was 2. American forces hit the boat once, destroying it. Then, according to investigations, they conducted a second strike specifically to kill 2 survivors who were clinging to wreckage in the water. Let me be crystal clear about what that means. That's executing survivors. That's not combat. That's not self-defense. Under international law, that's a war crime, and Congress is now investigating whether this happened. Multiple lawmakers from both parties have demanded answers. They want to know, did American forces deliberately kill people who were no longer a threat? The administration hasn't denied it. They've just refused to answer. But it gets worse. Of those 95 people killed, the administration claims they were all drug traffickers, all narco-terrorists, all members of dangerous cartels, really, all of them. 2 bodies washed up on the shores of Trinidad and Tobago after that first September strike. Locals identified one of them. He was a Venezuelan man, recognizable by his watch. People who knew him said he had been jailed for human trafficking charges after a boat he operated capsized in 2020. Was he a saint? No. But he was a small-time criminal, not some cartel kingpin. Here's the thing. We don't actually know who most of these people were, because they're dead. And dead people don't get trials. Dead people don't get to tell their side of the story. CNN reported that at least 1 strike didn't even target Venezuelans. It targeted Colombians on a boat departing from Colombia. Trinidad and Tobago police are investigating whether 2 of their citizens were among the dead. So we're not just killing alleged Venezuelan traffickers. We're killing people from other countries, in international waters, without any legal process whatsoever. The numbers that don't add up now. Here's the question nobody in power wants to answer. When did the war on drugs become a license to kill without trial? Because let's talk about the justification they're using. Trump has repeatedly said this is about stopping drugs that are killing Americans. He's claimed that 300,000 Americans died from drug overdoses last year because of drugs coming from Venezuela. That's not true. According to the CDC, about 80,000 Americans died from drug overdoses in 2024. That's still tragic, but Trump inflated the number by nearly 4 times. In one rambling statement to reporters, he even said 300 million Americans died from drugs, which would be almost the entire population of the United States. But here's the bigger lie, the one that makes this whole operation fall apart when you look at the evidence. Venezuela doesn't produce fentanyl, not a single kilogram. Fentanyl, which causes the vast majority of overdose deaths in America, comes from Chinese precursor chemicals that are manufactured into fentanyl in Mexico. It's then smuggled across the land border in tiny, easily concealed amounts. Not by boat, not through the Caribbean, through land routes. Every drug trafficking expert will tell you this. The fentanyl is coming through Mexico, not Venezuela. What about cocaine? Yes, some cocaine transits through Venezuela, but experts say Venezuela plays a limited role compared to other trafficking routes. Most cocaine goes through different countries, different waters, different pathways entirely. So if the stated justification doesn't match reality, what's really happening here? What's this really about? The escalation timeline that should terrify you. Let me show you how we got here, because the speed of this escalation should terrify you. August 2025. Carrier deployment announced. The Gerald R. Ford carrier strike group heads to the Caribbean. Mainstream media reports it as routine counter-narcotics operations. Nothing to see here. September 1, 2025. First strike. 11 people killed instantly. Video posted online shows a small vessel exploding in flames. Trump announces it from the White House. The media barely covers it beyond the initial reports. September 2025, more strikes follow. The administration calls them interdictions, law enforcement actions, certainly not acts of war. October 2025, Trump announces he's authorized the CIA to conduct covert operations inside Venezuela. This is extraordinary. Presidents don't usually announce covert operations. The whole point of covert operations is that they're secret, but Trump said it out loud in front of reporters almost casually. He's also asked whether the CIA has the authority to take out Maduro. Trump's response: he says it would be ridiculous for him to answer that question, which of course isn't a no. November 2025. Body count reaches double digits then scores, still no congressional authorization. The strikes continue, nobody stops them. December 2, 2025. Trump threatens to expand operations to Venezuelan soil. He doesn't ask Congress, he announces it in a cabinet meeting. He says, and I quote, "We're going to start doing those strikes on land too. The land is much easier. We know the routes they take, we know everything about them. We know where they live." Think about that phrasing. We know where they live. That's not talking about interdicting drug boats. That's talking about targeted killings of specific people. December 10, 2025. The U.S. military seizes a Venezuelan oil tanker off the coast of Venezuela. Video shows American forces rappelling from a helicopter onto the ship. Trump confirms the action and suggests the United States would keep the vessel's oil. That's piracy, there's no other word for it. December 16, 2025. Trump orders what he calls a total and complete blockade of all sanctioned oil tankers going into and out of Venezuela. He posts this on Truth Social, not through normal channels, not through a press conference, through social media. And he says Venezuela is completely surrounded by the largest armada ever assembled in the history of South America. December 17, 2025. Oil prices spike, markets react. The world suddenly realizes this isn't just about drugs anymore. This is economic warfare. This is a stranglehold on a nation's economy. Notice the pattern. Each step gets more aggressive. Each step goes further. And each step happens without asking the American people if this is what we want. This is how wars start in the 21st century, not with declarations. Not with debate, not with congressional votes. Just with gradual escalations, policy by policy, strike by strike, until suddenly we're in too deep to turn back. Gets constitutionally terrifying. And I mean that literally. This should terrify anyone who believes in American democracy. The United States Constitution is crystal clear. Article I, Section 8 gives Congress and only Congress the power to declare war. The founders put this in the Constitution specifically to prevent presidents from starting wars on their own. They wanted checks and balances. They wanted debate. They wanted the people's representatives to have a say before Americans were sent to kill and die. So did Congress authorize these strikes? No. Did Congress authorize the CIA operations? No. Did Congress authorize the blockade? No. Did Congress even get a vote on any of this? No. Did they get detailed briefings with evidence about who was being killed and why? No. House Democrats are now forcing war powers votes because the Trump administration has completely bypassed the legislative branch of government. They're conducting military operations that look, walk, and quack exactly like acts of war, without any congressional authority whatsoever. And the administration's defense, they're calling it counter-narcotics operations. Let that sink in for a moment. 95 people dead, a carrier strike group deployed, a naval blockade enacted, CIA covert operations authorized. Threats of land strikes inside a sovereign nation. All of this is happening right now as you watch this video, but according to the Trump administration, this isn't war. It's just drug enforcement. If you're thinking this sounds familiar, you're absolutely right, because we've seen this playbook before, and every single time it ends in disaster. Donald Trump has revived what he calls his maximum pressure campaign against Venezuela. And when Trump says maximum pressure, he means it. The bounty on President Nicolás Maduro's head, it was $25 million during Trump's first term. He just doubled it to $50 million. That's the same bounty we put on Osama bin Laden. Think about that. We're treating the president of Venezuela, a sovereign nation, like we treated the mastermind of 9/11 Venezuelan cartels. Trump has now designated them as foreign terrorist organizations. That's the same designation we use for ISIS, for Al-Qaeda, for groups that commit mass murder in pursuit of political goals. Until 2025, that label was reserved for actual terrorist groups. Now it's being applied to drug trafficking organizations. That might not sound like a big deal, but it is. Because once you label something a terrorist organization, you can justify almost anything in fighting it. The rhetoric from the administration has become increasingly militaristic. Trump has repeatedly accused Venezuela of flooding America with cocaine and fentanyl. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, Secretary of War as the administration now calls the position, has described this as a mission to defend the homeland from narco-terrorists. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who basically runs Venezuela policy for Trump, has gone even further. He said that the Maduro regime isn't really a government at all. It's a drug trafficking organization masquerading as a state. That's a direct quote. A transshipment organization, he called it. Do you see what's happening here? They're redefining Venezuela itself as a criminal enterprise, not a country. Not a government, just a gang with an army. And if it's not really a country, well, then all those international laws about sovereignty and territorial integrity don't apply, do they? There's just one massive problem with this entire narrative. Multiple problems, actually. But let's start with the biggest one. The experts who actually study drug trafficking, the ones who aren't trying to justify military action, they're saying the administration's claims don't match reality. Venezuela plays virtually no role in fentanyl trafficking. None. That's not coming from Venezuela. It's coming through Mexico, as I said earlier, from Chinese precursors. As for cocaine, yes, some transits through Venezuela. But Venezuela's role is actually quite limited compared to other routes. Colombia produces most of the cocaine. It goes through many different pathways. Venezuela is one route among many, and not even the most important one. So if the stated justification doesn't match reality, what's really happening here? The oil question nobody will answer. Let's talk about the thing that keeps coming up, but that nobody in the administration wants to address directly. Oil. Venezuela has the largest proven oil reserves in the world, 303 billion barrels. That's bigger than Saudi Arabia, bigger than Russia, bigger than Iraq, bigger than anyone. For context, that's about 17% of all the proven oil reserves on Earth. In one country. A country with the largest oil reserves in human history. But here's the catch. Venezuela currently produces less than 1 million barrels per day. Back in 2000, they were producing 3.2 million barrels per day. Their production has collapsed by about 70% over the last 25 years. Why? A combination of mismanagement under Maduro and Hugo Chavez before him, lack of investment in infrastructure, and, crucially, U.S. sanctions that have prevented Venezuela from accessing the technology, equipment, and expertise needed to maintain their oil industry. American oil companies that once operated in Venezuela were forced out. Venezuelan oil exports to the United States, which were once massive, were effectively banned in 2019. And now, with a naval blockade targeting oil tankers, Trump is cutting off Venezuela's last remaining economic lifeline. Venezuelan oil exports have already dropped to about 850,000 barrels per day. Of that, most goes to China at steep discounts on the black market. With the blockade, those exports could drop even further. We're talking about an existential economic crisis for the Venezuelan government. Trump has been remarkably candid about his interest in Venezuela's oil, at least in some moments. He's repeatedly said that if Maduro is ousted, the United States should have access to Venezuela's oil reserves. He suggested we'd keep the oil from a seized tanker. He's talked about Venezuela returning oil, land, and other assets that they supposedly stole from us, though it's never been clear what assets he's talking about. Meanwhile, multiple reports indicate that U.S. energy companies and financial firms are already planning for a post-Maduro Venezuela. A hedge fund manager told Slate magazine that a consortium of energy companies and financial firms are actively preparing to exploit Venezuela's oil reserves once Maduro is gone. Marco Rubio, Trump's Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, has a different stated goal. He wants to reshape the Western Hemisphere. He wants to slay the ghosts of Fidel Castro, as one analyst put it, by overturning socialist regimes in Latin America. For Rubio, this is ideological. It's about defeating leftist governments in America's backyard. But whether it's about oil or ideology or both, here's the bottom line. This isn't just about drugs. Nobody seriously believes this is only about drugs anymore. Is this about oil? Maybe. Is it about regime change? Definitely. Is it about establishing American dominance in the hemisphere? Almost certainly. And all of those might be legitimate foreign policy goals. You can debate whether they're good goals or bad goals. But the question is, shouldn't we have that debate before we start a war? If you're over 40, you might remember this story. You've lived through versions of it. If you're younger, pay close attention because history doesn't repeat, but it sure does rhyme. The 1980s. The Reagan administration conducts covert operations across Latin America. Nicaragua, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras. The justification: fighting communism, stopping drug traffickers, protecting democracy. The methods: training and funding paramilitary groups, CIA operations, arms deals, support for authoritarian governments that were friendly to the United States. The Iran-Contra scandal, where the U.S. illegally sold weapons to Iran and used the money to fund Nicaraguan rebels. The result: tens of thousands of people dead, democracies destabilized, civil wars that lasted years, entire countries traumatized, and the drug trade, it increased. The cartels got more powerful, more violent, and more entrenched. The 1990s and 2000s. Plan Colombia. The United States pours billions of dollars into Colombia to fight cocaine production at the source. Military aid, training, equipment, herbicides to destroy coca crops. The promise: will stop cocaine before it reaches America. The result: Colombian cocaine production went up and down but never stopped. The trafficking just shifted routes. When one route got shut down, another opened. The violence continued, civilian casualties mounted, and cocaine kept flowing into the United States. Early 2000s, the war in Afghanistan, part of the justification: stopping the opium trade. Afghanistan produced most of the world's opium. Surely, if we occupied the country, we could end it. The result: by the time American forces left in 2021, opium production in Afghanistan had actually increased. The Taliban, who we were fighting, made millions from the drug trade. 20 years, trillions of dollars, thousands of American lives, and the drug trade flourished. The Iraq War. The justification: weapons of mass destruction. An imminent threat to America. Absolute certainty from the Bush administration. Colin Powell at the UN with satellite photos and intelligence reports: we have to act now. The result: there were no weapons of mass destruction. The intelligence was wrong or exaggerated or fabricated, depending on who you ask. Hundreds of thousands of people died. Iraq descended into sectarian violence. ISIS emerged from the chaos. The region became even more unstable. And it cost American taxpayers trillions of dollars. Do you see the pattern? Every decade, we're told that military force is the answer. Every decade, we're promised that this intervention will be quick, clean, and successful. Every decade, the justification turns out to be exaggerated or based on faulty intelligence or just wrong. And every decade, the costs are enormous. Human costs, financial costs, strategic costs, moral costs. And now 2025. Maximum pressure on Venezuela. The justification: drugs, national security, terrorism, the military deployment, already happening, the strikes, already being carried out, the congressional authorization. Still waiting. Are we really going to do this again? Are we really going to make the same mistake for the 5th, 6th, 7th time? Because here's the thing about patterns: if you recognize them, you can break them. But if you ignore them, you're doomed to repeat them. What the experts are really saying: let's talk about what people who actually study these issues, people who don't have a political agenda, are saying about Trump's Venezuela campaign. UN officials have stated that the strikes likely violate international law. You can't just blow up boats in international waters because you suspect they're carrying drugs. That's not how international law works. Even if the boats were carrying drugs, which the administration hasn't actually proven in most cases, the killings would still be extrajudicial. They would still be illegal. Multiple human rights organizations have condemned the strikes as extrajudicial killings. Colombia and Venezuela have both accused the United States of murder. Russia and China at the UN Security Council have called this cowboy justice. Shoot first, ask questions never. Congressional Research Service reports, which are nonpartisan analysis for Congress, have raised serious questions about the legal basis for this campaign. They note that designating cartels as terrorist organizations doesn't automatically authorize military force. The law doesn't work that way. Multiple U.S. government lawyers have reportedly challenged the administration's legal justifications internally. These are lawyers who work for the administration, and even they're saying the legal reasoning doesn't hold up. The administration informed Congress in October that the U.S. is in a non-international armed conflict with drug cartels. This is a legal term. It's meant to justify using military force under the laws of war instead of law enforcement rules. But here's the problem. Armed conflict under international law has specific requirements. You can't just declare yourself in armed conflict. The other side has to be organized. There has to be sustained fighting. The violence has to reach a certain intensity. Are Venezuelan drug cartels really waging war against the United States like Al-Qaeda did? That's a stretch, a big stretch. Legal experts across the political spectrum have said this doesn't meet the definition of armed conflict under international law. But more importantly, even if it did, shouldn't Congress make that determination? Isn't that exactly what the Constitution requires? The Senate has twice rejected resolutions that would limit Trump's authority to continue these operations. Twice, Democrats introduced measures to rein in the president. Twice, they failed. Why? Because Republicans control the Senate. And most Republicans don't want to be seen as weak on drugs or soft on Venezuela. It's politically safer to let Trump do what he wants and avoid having their name attached to a vote that might come back to haunt them. But some Republicans are getting nervous too. Behind closed doors, some have expressed concerns about the legal basis for this, about whether this could spiral out of control, about whether we're stumbling into another quagmire. But expressing concerns behind closed doors isn't the same as voting to stop it. So here we are, the strikes continue, the blockade is in effect. The CIA is operating inside Venezuela. And all of this is happening with minimal oversight, minimal transparency, and minimal accountability. The 95 dead, let's talk about those 95 people who are dead, because they're not statistics. They're not just numbers in a press release. The administration calls them drug traffickers, narco-terrorists, members of criminal organizations. Maybe some of them were, maybe all of them were, we'll never know for certain because they're dead. They didn't get arrested, they didn't get lawyers, they didn't get trials, they didn't get to present evidence or tell their side of the story. They were killed in military strikes in international waters. And here's the uncomfortable truth that nobody in Washington wants to say out loud. Under international law, what happened to those 95 people is extrajudicial killing. You can't just execute people because you suspect them of crimes. Even if they are criminals, they have rights under international law. They have the right not to be killed without due process. But beyond the legal question, there's a moral one. Is this who we want to be as a country? America has always claimed to stand for due process, for the rule of law, for human rights. We've criticized other countries for doing exactly what we're doing now. We've condemned extrajudicial killings. We've said that everyone deserves a fair trial, but apparently that only applies when it's convenient, when it's people we like. When it's not interfering with our foreign policy goals. 2 bodies from that first strike washed up in Trinidad and Tobago. One was identified by locals. He had a past. He'd been in trouble with the law. But he was also somebody's son, somebody's brother, maybe somebody's father. He didn't get a trial, he got a missile. Some of the people killed were reportedly Colombians, not Venezuelans. Some might have been from Trinidad and Tobago. Some were probably forced into drug trafficking because they had no other economic options. Some were probably just in the wrong place at the wrong time. We don't know because they're dead. And when you're dead, you don't get to tell your story. And let's talk about that second strike. The one that allegedly killed survivors who were clinging to wreckage after the first attack. If that's true, if American forces deliberately targeted survivors who were no longer a threat, that's not just a war crime. That's murder, there's no other word for it. The Pentagon hasn't confirmed or denied this. They've just refused to provide details, which in itself is pretty damning. If it didn't happen, why not just say so? Washington debates military strategy. While Trump tweets about blockades and strikes, there are real people suffering in Venezuela. and most of them have nothing to do with drug trafficking or Maduro's government. 7.7 million Venezuelans have fled their country since 2015. Read that number again. 7.7 million people. That's more than the entire population of Paraguay. That's more than the populations of Uruguay and Panama combined. This is the largest refugee crisis in the history of the Western Hemisphere. It's larger than the Syrian refugee crisis. It's one of the largest displacement crises in the world. Why are they leaving? Because the economy has collapsed, because hyperinflation has made the currency worthless, because basic goods are scarce, because healthcare has crumbled, because they can't feed their families. 82% of Venezuelans live in poverty. More than half live in extreme poverty, meaning they don't have enough income to afford basic food. 5.1 million people inside Venezuela need humanitarian assistance. Over 4 million Venezuelan refugees and migrants in Latin America cannot meet their basic needs. They struggle to access food, housing, and healthcare. 60% face barriers to accessing healthcare. Half can't afford 3 meals a day. And here's the kicker. U.S. sanctions, which were meant to pressure Maduro into stepping down, have made life harder for ordinary Venezuelans while the ruling elite remain largely insulated. Maduro still has his mansions. His inner circle still has access to imported goods, but regular Venezuelans are starving. And now, with a naval blockade cutting off oil exports, things are about to get much, much worse. Venezuela's oil revenue, which is already a fraction of what it once was, is the main source of income for the government. Cut off the oil revenue and the economy doesn't just shrink, it collapses entirely. Who suffers when that happens? Not Maduro, not his generals, not the people making money from corruption and drug trafficking. They'll find ways to survive, they'll hoard resources, they'll flee to other countries if they need to. The people who suffer are ordinary Venezuelans, the ones working minimum wage jobs, the ones trying to keep their kids in school, the ones already skipping meals to make ends meet. And when the situation inside Venezuela becomes completely untenable, what do you think those people will do? They'll leave. They'll join the 7.7 million who have already fled. They'll risk their lives crossing the Darien Gap, one of the most dangerous migration routes in the world. They'll travel through multiple countries to reach the US-Mexico border. The Niskanen Center, a think tank, published a report modeling refugee flows from Venezuela after US intervention. Their estimates: in a short-term conflict scenario, 1.7 to 3 million additional Venezuelans could be displaced over 1 to 3 years. In a prolonged conflict scenario lasting 3 to 5 years, more than 4 million additional Venezuelans could flee. That's 14% of Venezuela's current population. And remember, the countries hosting Venezuelan refugees are already overwhelmed. Colombia has taken in millions. Peru, Ecuador, Brazil, Chile. These countries are straining to provide basic services. Their healthcare systems, education systems, and labor markets are being stretched to the breaking point. A massive new wave of refugees would absolutely overwhelm them. It would create a humanitarian catastrophe across the entire region. And many of those refugees will try to reach the United States. They'll cross the Darien Gap through Panama and Colombia. Over 520,000 migrants crossed the Darien in 2023. 63% of them were Venezuelans. Half of the children crossing were under 5 years old. Under 5 years old, trying to cross one of the most dangerous jungles on Earth. So here's the bitter irony. Trump says he's doing this to stop migration from Venezuela. That's one of his stated justifications. Stop the drugs, stop the migration. But every expert who studies migration says that this will cause a massive increase in Venezuelan migration. When you destroy a country's economy, when you make life inside the country impossible, people don't stay. They leave, so the policy that's supposedly meant to reduce migration will actually create the largest refugee crisis in the hemisphere's history. The question we should be asking is this: are these policies helping the Venezuelan people? Or are we collectively punishing an entire nation for the crimes of their government? Because if this escalates into full military conflict, if we end up with troops on the ground or sustained bombing campaigns, who do you think will pay the highest price? It won't be Maduro. He'll either flee to a friendly country or hide in a bunker. It won't be the cartel leaders. They'll adapt like they always do. It will be Venezuelan civilians caught in the crossfire. It will be the family trying to get to safety when a bomb destroys their neighborhood. It will be the child who can't access medical care because the hospital was damaged in an airstrike. It will be the elderly person who starves because food supplies are cut off. That's the human cost of war. And it's a cost that Venezuelans will pay not because they chose this, but because we chose it for them. The American cost nobody's calculating. Let's bring this home. Let's talk about what this costs America. Because there are costs even if we don't see them directly. First, there's the financial cost. The carrier strike group alone costs hundreds of millions of dollars to deploy and operate. Each airstrike costs money, each missile costs money. The CIA operations cost money. The additional troops in Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic cost money. And if this turns into a prolonged conflict or occupation, we're looking at billions or trillions of dollars. Iraq cost us over $2 trillion. Afghanistan cost us over $2 trillion. A war with Venezuela wouldn't be as large as either of those, but it could still cost hundreds of billions. Where's that money coming from? From you, from American taxpayers. From money that could be spent on infrastructure, education, healthcare, addressing the actual root causes of drug addiction in America. Because let's be real, the opioid crisis in America isn't happening because drugs are coming from Venezuela. It's happening because Americans are in pain, physical pain, emotional pain, economic pain. People turn to drugs when they're desperate, when they've lost hope, when they don't have access to mental health treatment or addiction services. You want to stop drug deaths in America? Invest in treatment programs. Make healthcare more accessible. Address the economic despair in communities that have been devastated by job losses and declining wages. But that's hard. That takes time. That requires long-term commitment. It's much easier politically to bomb boats and claim you're being tough on drugs. Second, there's the opportunity cost. Every dollar spent on military operations in Venezuela is a dollar not spent on something else. Not spent on fixing bridges and roads. Not spent on expanding broadband internet to rural areas. Not spent on making college more affordable or reducing medical debt. Think about what hundreds of billions of dollars could do if invested in America instead of in foreign military adventures. Third, there's the moral cost. Every unauthorized military strike, every civilian casualty, every international law we bend or break, it erodes America's standing in the world. It makes it harder for us to criticize other countries for doing the same things. It makes us look like hypocrites. When China violates human rights, we condemn them. When Russia invades Ukraine, we sanction them. But when we conduct extrajudicial killings in international waters, somehow that's different. The rest of the world is watching, and they're taking notes. They see the double standard. They see that international law only applies when America says it does, and that makes the world more dangerous for everyone, including Americans. Fourth, there's the cost in American lives. If this escalates to ground operations, American service members will die. For what? To stop drugs that keep flowing anyway, to overthrow a government and install what exactly? And even if we don't send ground troops, there are other risks. Venezuela has Russian-made surface-to-air missiles, over 5,000 of them according to Maduro's government. They have military equipment. They have a military that, while not as advanced as the US military, is still substantial. An American plane could be shot down, American ships could be attacked, American troops could be killed. And then what? Do we escalate further? Do we send more forces? Where does it end? We need to ask ourselves honestly and seriously. Is this worth it? Is overthrowing Maduro, assuming that's even possible, worth the cost in American lives and treasure? Who actually benefits from this? Let's follow the money, let's follow the power. Because when you do that, a very different picture emerges. A picture of who actually benefits from conflict with Venezuela: defense contractors. Every missile fired needs to be replaced. Every airstrike requires weapons that need to be manufactured. Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, Boeing, these companies make billions of dollars from military operations. And guess what? They also spend millions on lobbying and campaign contributions. Private military companies. Conflicts create demand for contractors, for logistics support, for intelligence gathering, for security services. These companies profit when the US military is engaged abroad. Oil companies. Multiple reports indicate that US energy companies are already positioning themselves for a post-Maduro Venezuela. They're planning how to access those 303 billion barrels of oil. A consortium of energy companies and financial firms are actively preparing business plans for Venezuelan oil fields. Politicians. Looking tough on drugs plays well with voters. Being able to say you took decisive action against narco-terrorists is great for campaign ads. It doesn't matter if it actually works. What matters is that it looks strong. Media outlets. Conflict drives ratings. War coverage, military footage, dramatic headlines about blockades and strikes, all of that generates clicks, views, and advertising revenue. A boring diplomatic resolution doesn't sell nearly as well as explosions and military action. So who benefits? Defense contractors, private military companies, oil companies, politicians who want to look tough. Media companies that profit from drama. Who doesn't benefit? The American taxpayer funding this operation. The Venezuelan people suffering under sanctions and potential war, the families of the 95 dead. American service members who might be sent into combat, countries in the region that will have to deal with millions of refugees. This is the calculus of modern warfare. The costs are socialized, spread across entire populations. The benefits are privatized, concentrated in the hands of corporations and political elites. And by the time the public realizes what's happening, by the time we understand the true costs, we're already committed. We're already in too deep, and it becomes almost impossible to change course without looking weak or admitting we made a mistake. That's how it always works. That's how we ended up in Iraq for 20 years. That's how we ended up in Afghanistan for 20 years. The people making the decisions rarely face the consequences of those decisions. Be absolutely clear about something because I don't want anyone to misunderstand my position. Nicolás Maduro is not a good leader. He's not someone I would defend. His government has been credibly accused of serious human rights violations. Political opponents have been jailed, protesters have been killed, elections have been rigged or canceled, the rule of law has been undermined, corruption is rampant. Democratic institutions have been hollowed out. Maduro inherited power from Hugo Chavez and has clung to it through increasingly authoritarian means. The Venezuelan people deserve better leadership. They deserve a government that's accountable to them. They deserve free and fair elections. But here's the question that nobody in the Trump administration wants to grapple with honestly. Does the fact that Maduro is a bad leader justify what's happening now? And more importantly, will military intervention actually produce a better outcome for the Venezuelan people? Because let's look at the track record. Let's look at what actually happens when the United States uses military force to remove a leader we don't like. Iraq, we removed Saddam Hussein. What came next? Sectarian violence. Civil war, the rise of ISIS. Hundreds of thousands dead, millions displaced. And Iraq is still struggling to achieve stability more than 20 years later. Libya, we helped remove Muammar Gaddafi. What came next? Civil war, competing governments. Militias fighting for control. A failed state, human trafficking, and Libya is still a mess more than a decade later. Afghanistan, we removed the Taliban. What came next? 20 years of occupation. A puppet government that collapsed as soon as we left. And the Taliban are back in power anyway. The pattern is clear. Removing a dictator through military force doesn't automatically produce democracy. It usually produces chaos. It creates power vacuums, and those vacuums get filled by whoever is most organized, most ruthless, and most willing to use violence. So what would happen if we removed Maduro? Who takes over? Is there an organized democratic opposition ready to govern? Or would we see different factions fighting for control? Would the Venezuelan military stay unified? Or would it fracture with different generals controlling different regions? What happens to Venezuela's weapons? They have thousands of missiles, rockets, and other military equipment. Does that fall into the hands of whoever can grab it? Do the drug cartels become more powerful in the chaos? Because that's what happened in other countries. When central authority collapses, criminal organizations often fill the void. And would the Venezuelan people be better off? Or would they suffer through years of instability while we tried to figure out how to put the country back together? These aren't hypothetical questions. We've seen this movie before, multiple times, and it never ends well. The Venezuelan people deserve better than Maduro. They absolutely do. But they also deserve better than becoming another case study in failed regime change. They deserve better than years of civil war and instability while different factions fight for power. So what's the alternative? That's the hard question. Because supporting Maduro isn't acceptable, but military intervention has failed every time we've tried it. The real answer is probably the most frustrating one: diplomacy. Sanctions that actually target Maduro's inner circle without crushing ordinary Venezuelans. Support for genuine democratic opposition inside Venezuela. Regional cooperation with other Latin American countries. Long-term engagement that creates pressure for reform without destroying the country. That's not sexy, that's not dramatic. That doesn't make for great TV or powerful campaign ads. But it's the approach that has the best chance of actually helping the Venezuelan people. What drug war? The 50-year failure nobody admits. Let's zoom way out for a moment and talk about the elephant in the room: the war on drugs. President Nixon declared the war on drugs in 1971. That was 54 years ago, more than half a century. In those 54 years, we've spent over $1 trillion fighting this war. $1 trillion. That's more than the GDP of most countries on Earth. We've incarcerated millions of people, mostly for nonviolent drug offenses. We've militarized police departments. We've conducted operations in dozens of countries. We've sprayed herbicides on foreign crops. We've funded paramilitary groups. We've overthrown governments. We've propped up dictators who promise to fight drugs, and what do we have to show for it? Drug use in America hasn't decreased. In fact, by some measures, it's increased. More Americans are dying from drug overdoses now than ever before in our history. The cartels have only grown more powerful, more violent, and more sophisticated. Every metric you can measure says the war on drugs has failed. It hasn't achieved its stated objectives. It hasn't made drugs less available. It hasn't made America safer. It hasn't reduced addiction. What it has done is create the largest prison population in the world. It has destabilized entire regions of Latin America. It has led to hundreds of thousands of deaths, maybe millions when you count all the violence in drug-producing countries. It has corrupted governments. It has militarized law enforcement. It has eroded civil liberties. And it has cost $1 trillion. So here's the uncomfortable question. What if the entire premise is wrong? What if treating a public health crisis as a military problem was always destined to fail? Because that's what drug addiction is. It's a health problem, it's a social problem, it's an economic problem. People don't become addicted to drugs because drugs are available. People become addicted to drugs because they're in pain, because they've lost hope, because they don't have access to treatment. You can interdict all the drug shipments you want. You can kill all the drug traffickers you want. As long as there's demand in America, someone will supply it. Economics 101. Where there's demand and profit, supply will find a way. The cartels know this. They've adapted to every enforcement strategy we've thrown at them. We shut down one route, they open another. We pressure one country, they shift to another. We arrest one kingpin, 10 more rise up to take his place. It's like playing whack-a-mole with an infinite number of moles. You can't win, but admitting that would require admitting that 50 years of policy has been wrong. It would require admitting that the $1 trillion was wasted. It would require fundamentally rethinking how we approach drug policy, and no politician wants to do that, because being soft on drugs is political suicide. It doesn't matter if the current approach doesn't work. What matters is looking tough. So instead, we keep doing the same thing over and over, expecting different results, which, as the saying goes, is the definition of insanity. Venezuela forces us to confront this. Because if we're willing to blockade a country, kill dozens of people, and potentially start a war, all in the name of stopping drugs, we better be damn sure it's actually going to work. And all the evidence, 5 decades of evidence, says it won't. The drugs will keep coming, the cartels will adapt, people in America will keep dying from overdoses, and we'll have spent billions more dollars and destroyed another country for nothing. When will we learn? How many times do we have to fail before we try something different? The propaganda machine and how your opinion is being shaped. Here's something you need to understand about how this story is being sold to you. Because it's not an accident, it's not random, it's very carefully calculated. Notice how the media coverage frames this. Maduro is always described as a dictator, as a narco-terrorist, as a threat. Which, to be fair, isn't entirely wrong. But notice what's rarely mentioned. U.S. sanctions have contributed to Venezuela's economic collapse. American policy has made life harder for ordinary Venezuelans. Previous U.S. interventions in Latin America have ended in disaster. Those facts are buried if they're mentioned at all because they complicate the narrative. They make it harder to justify military action. Notice how the 95 dead are described. Traffickers, narco-terrorists, members of dangerous cartels, not people, not human beings with families and stories, just enemy combatants, just targets. This is deliberate. It's called dehumanization. And it's a necessary step in making violence acceptable. Because it's a lot harder to justify killing someone if you think of them as a person, if you imagine their mother getting the news, if you think about their children who will grow up without a parent. But if they're just traffickers, just bad guys, just criminals, well, then their deaths don't matter as much, do they? Notice how questions about congressional authorization are treated. When they're covered at all, which is rare, they're framed as partisan bickering. Democrats trying to obstruct Trump. Not as a fundamental constitutional question about who has the authority to make decisions about war and peace. Notice how the oil angle is downplayed. It's mentioned occasionally but usually dismissed. Of course we're not doing this for oil. We're doing it to stop drugs. Don't be cynical, trust us. This is how public opinion is manufactured. This is how wars become acceptable. Not through honest debate about costs and benefits, but through careful framing that makes intervention seem like the only reasonable option. The administration frames it as a choice between doing nothing and letting drugs kill Americans or taking decisive action to protect our country. Those are the only 2 options presented. Either you support these strikes or you want Americans to die from drug overdoses. But that's a false choice. There are lots of other options: diplomacy, international cooperation, treating addiction as a health problem, addressing the root causes of drug demand, supporting democratic opposition in Venezuela without military force. But those options are either ignored or dismissed as naive, as weak, as insufficient. And the media largely goes along with it, because conflict is dramatic, military footage is compelling, and honestly, most journalists don't have the expertise to really interrogate the claims being made. When the administration says Venezuela is flooding America with drugs, reporters dutifully write it down. They might add a line like critics dispute this claim, but the administration's framing becomes the story. When Trump announces strikes, the coverage focuses on whether they're effective, not whether they're legal or justified in the first place. This is how we ended up in Iraq. The Bush administration said Saddam had weapons of mass destruction. The media repeated it. Anyone who questioned it was dismissed as unpatriotic or naive. And by the time the truth came out, we were already committed. I'm not telling you what to think about Venezuela. I'm asking you to think critically about how this story is being presented to you, to ask questions, to demand evidence, to consider who benefits from the narrative you're being sold, because your opinion matters. Public opinion is the last check on executive power. If the American people demand accountability, if we refuse to accept vague justifications and demand real answers, it becomes much harder for politicians to drag us into conflicts we don't want. But that only works if we're paying attention, if we're asking questions, if we're not just accepting what we're told. About what could happen from here, because we're at a genuine crossroads. The decisions made in the next few weeks or months will determine whether this becomes a footnote in history or a catastrophe that defines a generation. Scenario 1, de-escalation. This is the best-case scenario, but it's also the least likely. In this scenario, Congress actually asserts its authority. The House and Senate force votes on war powers. Enough Republicans join Democrats to block further military action. Trump is forced to seek congressional authorization for any continued operations. He can't get the votes. The strikes stop. The blockade ends. We return to sanctions and diplomatic pressure. International pressure also plays a role. Latin American countries, tired of U.S. intervention in their backyard, demand a diplomatic solution. Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico broker negotiations. Regional organizations get involved. The U.S. agrees to lift some sanctions in exchange for concessions from Maduro. Maybe an agreement to hold internationally monitored elections. Maybe protections for political opponents. It's not perfect, but it's better than war. This is what should happen, but will it? Probably not. Because it requires political courage. It requires Republicans to stand up to Trump. It requires Democrats to be unified. It requires Trump to accept limits on his power, which he has never done willingly. The political incentives all point the other way. It's easier to go along, safer to avoid being blamed for looking weak, more convenient to let someone else take the risk of opposing the president. So the most likely scenario isn't de-escalation. It's scenario 2. Scenario 2, continuation and normalization. What's happening now just keeps happening. This is actually the most probable outcome. More strikes, more deaths. The body count slowly rises. 95 becomes 150, then 200, then 300, each one barely covered by the news, each one just another statistic. The blockade continues. Venezuelan oil exports drop even further. The economy contracts. More people flee, but not all at once. Just a steady stream that becomes the new normal. The CIA continues covert operations inside Venezuela. We don't know what they're doing because it's covert, but periodically there are reports of attempted coups, of plots to assassinate Maduro, of sabotage operations. All deniable. All below the threshold that would force a real reckoning. Congress grumbles but doesn't act. A few votes here and there, but nothing binding, nothing that actually stops the operations. Because stopping it would require a veto-proof majority, and that's not going to happen. The American public largely forgets about it. It's not dramatic enough to stay in the news cycle. No American casualties yet. No disasters that force attention. Just a low-grade military campaign that becomes background noise. This is how we stayed in Afghanistan for 20 years. This is how we've had troops in Syria for years without most Americans even knowing. This is how wars become permanent fixtures that we just accept. The danger of this scenario isn't that it explodes into catastrophe immediately. The danger is that it becomes normalized, that extrajudicial killings become routine, that military actions without congressional approval become standard, that we accept executive war powers as the new reality. And then one day something goes wrong, which brings us to Scenario 3. Scenario 3, major escalation. This is the nightmare scenario, and it's more possible than most people realize. Something goes wrong. It could be lots of things. A Venezuelan ship fires back at American forces. A U.S. plane is shot down by one of those Russian surface-to-air missiles. American troops conducting a covert operation are captured or killed. It could be something simpler. A strike hits the wrong target and kills civilians in a dramatic way that gets caught on camera. A boat full of fishermen or refugees gets destroyed and the footage goes viral. International outrage forces a response. Or Trump decides that limited strikes aren't working and orders expanded operations. Strikes on Venezuelan military bases. Strikes on government buildings. Maybe even targeted strikes aimed at killing Maduro himself or his inner circle. Maduro responds. He has to politically. He can't just let American planes bomb his country without responding. So Venezuelan forces attack something, maybe a U.S. ship, maybe installations in Puerto Rico or Colombia. Maybe they conduct cyber attacks on U.S. infrastructure. Trump uses that response as justification for even more military action. We were attacked, he says, we have to defend ourselves, and suddenly we're in a shooting war. Once American casualties occur, everything changes. The political calculus shifts entirely. Any suggestion of de-escalation gets framed as abandoning the troops, as letting American deaths go unanswered, as showing weakness to our enemies. The pressure to escalate becomes overwhelming. More strikes, maybe ground operations, special forces raids, perhaps even a full-scale invasion with the goal of removing Maduro and occupying Caracas until we can install a new government. And then what? Then we own Venezuela. We own the chaos that follows. We own the civil war that might erupt. We own the humanitarian catastrophe. We own the insurgency that could last years or decades. We become an occupying power in a country that doesn't want us there. And history shows us exactly how that ends. Which of these scenarios happens depends on choices that are being made right now. On whether Congress acts. On whether Trump restrains himself. On whether something goes wrong that forces escalation. The scary thing is that we have very little control over it. Most of us are just watching, hoping that the people in power make wise choices. Hoping that luck holds. Hoping that we don't stumble into disaster. But hope isn't a strategy. And history suggests that when military forces are deployed, when strikes are being conducted, when tensions are high, eventually something goes wrong. The question isn't whether something could go wrong. The question is what happens when it does. What you can actually do about this, if you've watched this far, you're probably feeling some combination of angry, frustrated, scared, or helpless. Those are all valid feelings, but helplessness is the one we need to fight against. Because you can do something. It might not feel like much, but collective action starts with individual choices. First, contact your representatives in Congress. I know, everyone says this and it feels useless. But it actually matters, especially now. Call your senators and your representative. You don't need to give a speech. Just say, I'm calling about U.S. military operations in Venezuela. I want to know where you stand on requiring congressional authorization before any further escalation. If enough people call, if enough constituents demand answers, it creates political pressure. It forces politicians to take a position. It makes it harder for them to just go along quietly. Find your representative's contact information online. It takes 5 minutes. Make the call. It's one of the most direct forms of democratic participation available to you. Second, share information. Not just this video, though you can if you found it useful, but credible news sources covering this story, articles from reputable journalists, reports from human rights organizations. The mainstream media has largely ignored this crisis because it's complicated and doesn't generate ratings. Social media might be our best tool for forcing it into public consciousness, but be careful about what you share. Misinformation helps nobody. Stick to credible sources. Check facts before sharing. The goal is to inform people, not to spread conspiracy theories or exaggerations. Third, support organizations working on this issue. There are humanitarian groups helping Venezuelan refugees. There are human rights organizations documenting abuses. There are think tanks and advocacy groups pushing for better policy. Find ones you trust and support them. Even small donations add up. And many of these organizations also provide ways to take political action, like signing petitions or joining campaigns. Fourth, educate yourself. Keep learning about U.S. policy in Latin America, about the war on drugs, about the costs of military intervention. The more informed you are, the harder it is for propaganda to work on you. Read different perspectives. Don't just consume media that confirms what you already believe. Challenge your own assumptions. Seek out expert opinions from people who actually study these issues. Fifth, talk to people. Have conversations with friends and family. Not arguments, conversations. Share what you've learned. Listen to their perspectives. Find common ground. Most Americans, regardless of political affiliation, don't want another endless war. Most people don't want us killing people without due process. Most people understand that the war on drugs hasn't worked. The divisions between Americans are real, but they're also exaggerated. There's more common ground than the media makes it seem. Finding that common ground, building coalitions across political lines, that's how you create real pressure for change. And finally, remember this moment. Remember how easily we can slide into military conflict. Remember how little debate happened before the shooting started. Remember the pattern, because this won't be the last time. There will be another crisis. Another country that needs regime change. Another justification for military action. And the question is whether we'll recognize the pattern and demand something better, or whether we'll just repeat the same mistakes again. Certain. What can't be disputed even by people who support Trump's policy. The United States is conducting military operations against Venezuela without congressional authorization. 95 people are dead, a naval blockade is in effect. The CIA is operating inside Venezuela. Threats of land-based strikes have been made, the situation is escalating. The justification, stopping drug trafficking from Venezuela, doesn't align with what independent experts say about Venezuela's actual role in the drug trade. Venezuela plays virtually no role in fentanyl trafficking. Its role in cocaine trafficking is limited compared to other routes. The legal basis for these operations is contested by many legal scholars, including some within the U.S. government. The administration's claims about being in an armed conflict with cartels stretch the definition of armed conflict beyond recognition. The pattern mirrors previous U.S. interventions in Latin America, and every single one of those interventions ended in disaster, chaos, instability, death, suffering, and failure to achieve stated objectives. The humanitarian costs are already severe and will get worse. 7.7 million Venezuelans have already fled. Millions more could be displaced by continued conflict. The economic impact of the blockade will cause suffering for ordinary Venezuelans, while Maduro's elite remain largely insulated. The costs to America, financial and moral, could be enormous. If this escalates to a full conflict or occupation, we're looking at potentially trillions of dollars and unknown numbers of American casualties. And it's all happening with minimal public debate, minimal media coverage, and minimal democratic oversight. Whether you support Trump or oppose him, whether you think Maduro is a threat or a symptom of larger problems, whether you believe the war on drugs is working or failing, we should all agree on one fundamental principle. Decisions about war and peace should involve the American people. They should involve Congress. They should involve debate, evidence, and careful consideration of alternatives. They should require more than one person's decision. What's happening with Venezuela right now violates that principle. It's executive action without legislative approval. It's military escalation without public discussion. It's bodies piling up while America looks away. And if we don't speak up now, if we don't demand answers now, we might wake up one day to find ourselves in another war we never agreed to fight. Another occupation that lasts decades. Another catastrophe that costs trillions and achieves nothing. The question isn't whether you're liberal or conservative. The question isn't whether you like Trump or hate him. Those questions are almost irrelevant here. The question is simpler and more fundamental. Do you believe in democracy? Do you believe that decisions about war should require more than one person's signature? Do you believe that American military power should be used carefully, legally, and only when absolutely necessary? If you answered yes to any of those questions, then Venezuela should terrify you. Because right now, those principles are being violated, and we're letting it happen. This isn't about Trump personally, though he's the one making these decisions. It's about the system. It's about precedent. It's about what we're willing to accept as normal. Because whatever happens in Venezuela, whatever precedents are set here, they won't stay in Venezuela. They'll become the new baseline for executive power. They'll be the justification for the next intervention and the one after that. They'll be cited when the next president, whoever that is, wants to conduct military operations without congressional approval. The erosion of democratic norms doesn't happen all at once. It happens gradually, decision by decision, precedent by precedent. Each one seems small in isolation, but they add up. And before you know it, we're living in a country where the president can start wars on his own authority, where military strikes are routine and unquestioned, where Congress is a rubber stamp instead of a check on executive power. We've been here before, we've seen this movie. We know how it ends. Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Vietnam before that, Latin America in the 80s. Over and over, we've watched American military power deployed with promises of quick victory and lasting peace. Over and over, we've seen those promises turn to dust. Over and over, we've counted the costs in lives and treasure and realized we were lied to or misled or just wrong. The only question is whether this time, finally, we'll choose a different ending. whether we'll demand real debate before committing to military action, whether we'll insist on congressional authorization, whether we'll learn from history instead of repeating it. That choice isn't up to the politicians, it's not up to the media, it's not up to the generals or the defense contractors or the oil companies, it's up to us. To American citizens who can still demand accountability from our elected representatives, who can still vote, who can still speak up, who can still say no, not again, not this time. Democracy only works if people participate. If we pay attention, if we ask questions, if we demand better. Right now most Americans don't even know that any of this is happening. They don't know about the 95 dead. They don't know about the blockade. They don't know about the CIA operations. They don't know we might be stumbling into another war. That ignorance isn't an accident, it's a feature, not a bug. Because an informed public is harder to lead into war. An informed public asks uncomfortable questions. An informed public demands justification and evidence and alternatives. That's why sharing information matters. That's why having conversations matters. That's why contacting your representatives matters. Because collectively, those actions create an informed public. And an informed public is the last line of defense against unnecessary wars. Thank you for watching this entire video. I know it's long, I know it's heavy. I know it's probably not what you wanted to hear today, but sometimes the truth is uncomfortable. Sometimes the truth requires us to confront things we'd rather ignore. Sometimes the truth demands action instead of comfort. If this video made you think, share it. If it made you angry, channel that anger into something productive. If it made you want to learn more, use the sources in the description to keep educating yourself. But most importantly, don't just watch and forget. Do something, call your representatives, talk to people, stay informed. Stay engaged, because what happens next in Venezuela and what precedents get set for American foreign policy, that depends on whether we're paying attention, on whether we're willing to speak up, on whether we demand better from our leaders. The future isn't written yet, history isn't inevitable, we still have choices. We can still choose a different path, but only if we act, only if we refuse to accept this as normal. Only if we remember that in a democracy, ultimate power belongs to the people, not to presidents or generals or corporations. The choice is ours. The time is now. What happens next depends on what we do today. Don't let them drag us into another war in silence. Make noise, demand answers, fight for the democracy we claim to believe in. Thank you for listening, now go make your voice heard. The truth they don't want you to know, 95 people dead. A blockade choking an entire nation. CIA operations in the shadows, and all of it happening without your consent, without congressional approval, without any real justification. The question now is, what are you going to do about it? If this video opened your eyes, if it made you angry, if it made you realize how easily we're being dragged into another war, then I need you to do 3 things right now. First, smash that like button. I know everyone says that, but here's why it actually matters. YouTube's algorithm suppresses controversial political content like this. The only way this reaches more people is if you actively engage with it. Every like tells YouTube that people want to see this information. So hit that like button right now. Second, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. Because this story isn't over. Trump is escalating this situation every single day. New developments are happening as we speak. And the mainstream media isn't covering it. If you want to stay informed about what's really happening in Venezuela, about the refugee crisis that's coming, about whether we're heading toward full-scale war, you need to subscribe. I'll be covering every update, every lie, every new escalation as it happens. And hit that bell icon, turn on all notifications. Because when major breaking news happens with Venezuela, you'll want to know immediately. Third, and this is the most important one, leave a comment right now. Tell me, do you think Congress should have authorized these strikes before they happened? Do you believe Trump's justification about drugs, or do you think this is really about oil and regime change? And most importantly, are you willing to contact your representatives and demand answers? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Let's have a real conversation. And if you know someone who needs to see this, someone who has no idea this is even happening, share this video with them. Send it to your family, your friends, your coworkers, post it on your social media. Because the only way we stop this from spiraling into another endless war is if enough Americans wake up and demand accountability. The media won't do it, the politicians won't do it, it's up to us. So hit that like button, subscribe, comment below, and share this video everywhere because the clock is ticking. Every day we stay silent is another day closer to a catastrophe that could cost thousands of lives and trillions of dollars. Don't let them drag us into another war in silence. I'll see you in the next video. Stay informed, stay angry, and stay loud.